Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another session here at the Healthcare World Festival. Hot on the heels of what I thought was a brilliant session this morning on public-private partnerships in the Middle East. We're taking a small hop across the Atlantic in a way that we can only do in this brave new world of virtual events, and having a look at the American healthcare system. We are joined by an expert in that field, Ernesto Chinona, who is the Business Development Director at CSSI Life Sciences. Has taken delegations from Maryland across the world to talk healthcare and is eminently qualified to answer all of our questions on US healthcare. He's going to give us a short presentation, then we'll open the floor for questions. We have a number of our trade mission attendees here on the call to ask some of those questions, and please feel free to put your questions for Ernesto in the chat. But first, he's going to give us a short presentation. So Ernesto, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you so much for joining me today. A wonderful afternoon if you're joining us from the UK, and good morning if you're joining us from the United States. I'm Ernesto Chinona. I'm the Director of Business Development here at CSSI Life Sciences, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Today, I'll be taking us on a small journey through partnerships in healthcare and how UK-based or any international company can really benefit from partnering with the US. And really, what does that mean? I'm a cancer immunologist by training. I started out my career in basic research science at the National Cancer Institute based here in Maryland. And then I transitioned to the Maryland Department of Commerce, where I was part of the economic development engine, if you will, of the state, where I helped and I contributed to the life science partnerships between the Midlands engine and the Northern Powerhouse in Maryland, the state of Maryland. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what that means. Thank you so much to my friend and my colleague Louise Stock for inviting me here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about what these partnerships mean. And so what's always interesting to me about companies that I've met from overseas that are interested in the US market is that it can be pretty daunting with respect to where to even begin and who to even approach with respect to really finding representation and support so that companies from overseas can take advantage of the sponsorship, if you will, from the US government, establishing a US-based subsidiary, really integrating into one of the hubs here, and then accessing those resources. Yes, the United States itself is not really a biotechnology hub. There's many smaller biotechnology hubs scattered throughout the US. And so it's really about understanding where to go and integrating into one of the hubs that makes the most sense, where you will really find everything you need along that med tech or that drug development pathway. And so whether that be the real estate, the talent, the wonderful economic development incentives and introductions to stakeholders by your network that's growing, and finding those strategic partners and investors that are really going to accelerate the commercialization of your technology. And so we take a look at, so what are if we're going to talk about partnerships and who are the partners? Definitely government, and at different levels of government, you'll find different benefits. I find that not everyone understands how important it is to approach the state government and even the county government within a state where biotechnology hubs reside, as opposed to the federal government, which is big, which can be difficult to navigate. And so we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons there, the academic sector and what they bring to the table really early in that discovery and intellectual property protection and licensing stage. Public-private partnerships, so kind of an ongoing conversation similar to perhaps what you've discussed with the Middle East. What does it mean to be involved with the public-private partnership in the US, and what do they have to offer? And then the service industry. At CSSI Life Sciences, we're a regulatory consulting firm. We establish that regulatory strategy for product development, whether it be medtech or drugs. And then help plug in all the CROs along the way that are necessary for the appropriate testing for regulatory approval. And then foster those introductions to the payers and the buyers for those that are interested in those strategic exits. And so depending on what those may be. And so along the spectrum, there's startup business support and there's funding for companies. And so, and for the technologies out there that want to make it in the American market, it'll be critical to really find yourself connected to those. And so we like to say we're at CSSI that you're developing that roadmap, that strategy. And so for the most part, I've noticed that US-based stakeholders really want to know what those milestones are that you have to meet in order to enter the market. Are you ready to go? And you have approval in the UK and you have the CE mark, or are you earlier in that regulatory process? And perhaps you're looking for a harmonized strategy between the US and the UK and the EU and Australia. And so what does that timeline look like? What do those costs look like? It's going to be really important to understand what your intellectual property looks like, so that when you're engaging those partners, you have the answers to all these questions. It'll just make it that much easier because that's the expectation really from a US-based stakeholder. And so why would you want to form a partnership with a US company? Aside from the obvious, you want to enter the US market, well, what that really means is that you're really taking advantage of some of the tax credits and incentives that state governments have to offer, in addition to some that the US government has to offer. But it's really tightening that mentorship group. That network of entrepreneurs, that network of local stakeholders, academic researchers, that are really going to help launch that technology. Government resources, and this is typically the federal government that has some money, non-dilutive funding for companies like yours, and then introduction to local investor groups. Once that technology has matured, how do you approach a US investor and what are they actually looking for? We find that the technologies don't fail. It's the founders who fail because they're not ready, they're not prepared to have those conversations. And then when you're ready to go, post FDA approval, what does that reimbursement strategy look like in our very fragmented, privatized healthcare system? How do you even go about approaching a hospital to enter their supply chain? I mean, what does that mean when each hospital system is its own independent universe? And so where do you even begin with that? And so let's talk about partnerships with kind of the early stages. One question is, who do you go to? I mean, who knows the US market? Well, there's really no such thing as the US market. You want to start way more local than that, and you want to say, well, what does the market in California, maybe South San Francisco look like, versus that in Baltimore and at Johns Hopkins? What are the needs of those physicians? Drugs can be a little bit more global, medtech can be a little bit more local. What are those bio-affiliated trade associations that are really going to help me connect to everyone in my immediate vicinity? I don't need to know everyone everywhere across the US to be successful. I need to know locally in my biotech hub. If I'm going to be in Maryland, I need to know the Maryland Technology Council. I need to know public-private partnerships like the Technology Development Corporation and the Economic Development Corporations, because they're the ones that are going to know the market, the local market, because that's all you really need to be successful, at least at the very beginning, and then you grow from there. The US federal government, how much of the local market do they know? That's hard to understand. The U.S. Commercial Service does a wonderful job of connecting people, and they'll know the local stakeholders that know the local market a lot better. So the U.S. Commercial Service would probably point you in the direction of the Maryland Department of Commerce, and then the Maryland Department of Commerce. Those are the folks that you want to go to. The Maryland Technology Council, those are the folks you want to go to say, hey, so this is where my technology is at. This is where my company's at. This is where I want to go. Who could help me get there? And so the genesis of our talk today was really because of the incredible relationship between Maryland and the UK Midlands, who signed a life sciences trade agreement back in 2019. And I was part of the Maryland Department of Commerce at the time. And we were incredibly active in pairing our companies at the trade delegations together. So we went to Arab Health in January, then we had an outbound delegation in March, and then we met at Bio in Philadelphia. Then we had an inbound delegation after Advamed in Boston. So then we met again in Baltimore, and then we met again in Dusseldorf. So it was an incredibly productive time, but that's because the local state government and the Midlands engine understood who the companies were. And we were very proactive about saying, okay, this is our portfolio, that's your portfolio, we have these needs, you provide these solutions. Let's matchmake our companies. And so whenever you're looking at why the United States and what does that mean for my company, oftentimes folks are pointed to the Small Business Innovation Research Program at the federal government. This program spans a lot of different agencies across the U.S. government, and it really provides non-dilutive funding for companies that are in our healthcare innovative space. But what does it mean, though, to be able to be eligible for these kinds of programs? Your US-based subsidiary has to be owned, by and large, by an American citizen. And so what does that mean in terms of structuring your company internationally? And there are stakeholders and it says essentially law firms that can help you answer those questions to best take advantage of being able to meet these requirements and participate in our government programs. The Federal Lab Consortium is a wonderful group that I would be more than happy to make an introduction to. They are a group of all the federal laboratories, and they have their own funding programs, a lot of intellectual property available for out licensing, if that's what you're interested in, and a lot of lab-specific programs that are there to help companies with their product development. And lastly, from the federal space, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. The US military has a substantial budget, needless to say, and navigating these grants can be pretty tricky, but nonetheless, there is a lot of money set aside for basic research science all the way through the commercialization of that science. And so if you're in the warfighter space, there's nothing like licensing a technology from the US military and then selling it back to them. They're not in the commercialization business. However, they do have a lot of intellectual property that they would like companies like yours to develop and commercialize that, because they're the ones that are interested in purchasing it. And so something to think about. Lots of opportunity there with the Department of Defense. Public-private partnerships are another type of entity that you would really want to get to know. Once you have a better idea of what technology hub you want to enter based on your therapeutic area of interest, based on your type of technology. These could be the local trade associations. I mentioned the Maryland Technology Council, and the local economic development associations. What's interesting is that a lot of pseudo-government or quasi-government agencies appear to be part of the government, but they're actually public-private partnerships. And it works similar to other countries, but really it saves the organization from the ebbs and flows of political tides by handling public funds, but being resistant to kind of the ever-changing landscape there. And so the Maryland Technology Development Corporation is a prime example of that. They're the venture capital arm of the state. And so you have a startup. It's based in Maryland. Sure, they invest not at the level that you would see in a VC firm, perhaps, or at the federal government level, but they invested $800,000 in four life science companies and $900,000 using the GAP fund and two other life science companies in fiscal year 2020. And so they don't have the breadth or the reach that other companies do, or the private equity firms do, but these are the resources that you want to find and tap in your local biotech hub that are really going to make a difference in terms of the commercialization of your technology. And they also have a whole bunch of different programs, grant writing programs for the SBIR program, for example, market databases, pitch competitions, all that good stuff that serves the local market. And so, so it's part of your research and your due diligence to where you're going to land is looking to see, what resources there are available at these public-private partnerships that cater specifically to the life sciences sector. So academic and government labs can be found, of course, at universities with a research center, and the government labs are predominantly in Maryland and around the Washington, D.C. region, but you can find NIH labs and EPA labs across the U.S. And they actually have a lot of programs that cater to small businesses. The NIH is a brand that everybody knows, but little do people know how much they can actually work with small businesses for co-development of technology. A lot of free consulting from the federal government as a federal employee. I was at the NIH once upon a time. You can't really charge for information. And so there's a lot of experts at the NIH that can help you really hone in on your technology. You can perform experiments for the NIH if you want to contract with them, or they can perform experiments for you if they have the animal model you're looking for, if they have the instrument that you're looking for, and it's typically a lot more affordable to go this way than perhaps a commercial CRO. And of course, they have a ton of intellectual property that's available for licensing, and it's the federal government. They don't take royalties, and so it's a pretty affordable license. They license about 6 to 10 technologies a week from the NIH across the world. And I would be more than happy to introduce you to the folks at the National Institutes of Health if that is something that you're interested in. And you don't have to be a US-based company to engage the NIH at all. They work with companies all over the world. So that's some low-hanging fruit right there to get your foot in the door. If you are looking, however, to actually land physically, we have relationships at CSSI Life Sciences with a lot of different incubators across the US. And so that really is because we help those incubators really manage their portfolio, understand the commercial feasibility of the companies, and then provide that regulatory and product development strategy and even the clinical strategy for those companies so that they obtain regulatory approval in a way that really mitigates time, risk, and expense. And so if anyone's interested, we would welcome if we could do the introduction to any of our partners, and we can help you decide where it is best for you to land given your technology and what these different incubators have to offer. And we wouldn't charge at all for any sort of introduction or anything like that. We're just more than happy to make the connection for our partners. So partnerships for regulatory approval. So depending on where your company's at, and we'll get to those kind of that are looking for distributors and stuff like that in a little bit. But from our experience anyway, US-based investors really like to see that there's a commercial development plan that incorporates regulatory approval in some way, shape, or form, and the costs associated with regulatory approval. And so these are kind of the, if you will, the capital asset, the the perks of really understanding what that regulatory strategy should be. And I'll share these slides with everyone. Where we like to take our companies is to the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference that happens in January in San Francisco every year. We host a partnering event for our companies that has helped them raise $700 million. As we are in partnership with the Midlands, we'd be more than happy to invite you guys to participate. We don't charge for participating at our JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. It is more of a space for companies to raise funds and then hopefully choose us as their regulatory partner. And we've seen that's a model that works really well once they're capitalized and are ready to kind of move forward. And so we have about 700 attendees in non-COVID years. So in 2020, that happened in January. It was like right before the pandemic hit the United States, or before it was detected that it hit the United States. And in 2021, it was virtual. This year, I think it's going to be a hybrid model of the two. And the reason why it's so important, at least for developing these relationships early on in the game, in the commercialization process of drugs, is because it takes about 10 years to commercialize a drug in the US, and about $1.4 billion to do that. And so it's not surprising that less than 12% of drugs really entering phase 1 are actually approved. A lot of companies exit way before the 10 years are up. Somewhere around year 5 during or 6 after clinical trials, after they've shown some efficacy. And so once that company reaches a value inflection point, that's where we come in and we help make those introductions to strategic partners for out licensing. And so this is kind of like the overview of the major steps in the regulatory process. This is how you get your drug into the healthcare system in the US. The value of death is really the gap between taking a research project and converting that into a product that is investor ready. That seems to be something that there's a huge gap in know-how, and really it's because a lot of these early stage CEOs are more scientists than they are businessmen and businesswomen, and it's hard sometimes to understand what those steps are. So, which is why a regulatory partner is incredibly important, because they help you outline what those steps are to get into that pre-IND, which is investigational new drug, meeting with the FDA. A lot of folks that are interested in entering the US market, they want a meeting with the FDA, and that's great. A pre-IND meeting, they make it seem like you're having coffee with the FDA and they're going to tell you what your regulatory strategy should be. And in fact, it's not the case. It's really a time for you to pose an argument to the FDA as why you believe your product should be regulated the way that you think it should be regulated, and see if the FDA agrees with you, because a lot of these new technologies may not have a lot of precedent. And so, it's a very tricky meeting. All of these meetings are incredibly structured. And there's a strategy to meeting with the FDA to get their buy-in, but not allow them to raise a ton of red flags that perhaps wouldn't be raised if the meeting was conducted appropriately. The FDA never forgets, and so if there's any kind of big question raised, that'll translate to a lot of experimentation and a lot of time that your company may not want to spend both financially and time-wise to move on to the next step. And so just something to think about as companies are interested in moving forward with the process. What happens when there's an inadequate preparation for FDA meetings? The most common problems are that CMC, which is chemistry manufacturing controls, so there's just not adequate enough information on how that's going to happen, or insufficient preclinical support. Clinical trial designs that are not acceptable, and there's, based on your indication and your preclinical work, and your pre-IND enabling studies, that's what's really gonna define what your clinical trial designs are. And so if there's a mismatch there, it doesn't really move forward very often with the FDA. Non-compliance with good clinical practices and what that means, and then lack of information on selection of dosage. So a lot of work goes into dosing. It's something to take very seriously, and it's a pitfall that we've all often seen in companies that go into a meeting unprepared. In terms of med tech companies, we have what we call quality management system. For the med tech suppliers out there, you don't need that to really get FDA approval, but you do need that when you're ready to commercialize, and if you're looking to sell to a hospital, because the FDA will enforce compliance through random inspections of your quality management system. And so that's something that, and it's a system that is certified. A lot of regulatory consultants have one that they will sell to their clients so that they're ready to go. And there are, of course, fees to pay to the FDA. One reason to find a partnership with a US-based entity is so that you don't pay the non-US or international fee. It's a lot more inexpensive to obtain regulatory approval as a domestic company. And the reason is because it's a lot easier to become to qualify as a small business as a domestic company. And so you can pay $3,000 to file a 510K, which is the regulatory approval for most med tech, or $12,000. Right. And if you're a domestic company, the first time you file is free. That is not the case for foreign companies. And so we do our best to help even companies set up a virtual entity, because that's really all you really need in order to go through the FDA process as a domestic entity. And lastly, just real quick, partnerships for commercialization. Understanding that reimbursement system is going to be really important. Every procedure and type of technology has what we call a CPT code. That's the code that a doctor uses to tell the insurance company, I performed this service. And so that means that then the insurance company will pay the doctor back for the service provided or for the use of that equipment. If you have a novel technology that requires a new CPT code, that's a whole can of worms for another day. We can go on about that for quite some time. It's really finding existing CPT codes that you can use so that you can approach a hospital and say, I would like to enter your healthcare system, your hospital chain. This is how it's going to be reimbursed. At that hospital system, having that physician champion, so that doctor who wants to use your technology, and having a conversation with a supply chain executive who is going to really make the decision whether the hospital can afford the technology or not. So typically it takes both conversations and both angles to get that technology to be considered in an internal review committee. And this is typical for most hospital systems in the US. Sadly, you have to go hospital system by hospital system. So in the biotech hub you decide to reside in, that's the hospital system you're going to target first. There's a lot of help by word of mouth that your technology is fantastic, but getting it in there really requires conversations with key personnel at these hospitals. They're probably going to ask you to supply a few of your devices for testing and for review internally before they decide to go ahead and then procure from you. And so, and likewise, strategic exits, whether it's going to be an upscale manufacturer, whether it's going to be a big box retailer like our big pharmacies like CVS or Walgreens, or whether you want to sell and out-license your technology to pharma and medtech strategics, or whether you want to contract with the government. This is all about those warm introductions. It's all about, through those partnerships that you develop in the US, that asking, hey, so I want to move into this, I want to go public, I want to enter, your pharmacies. How do I go about doing that, and who do I talk to? And that's what this is all about. And happy to help navigate the hubs that we know, but at least now you have a better idea of what it means, and where to begin, hopefully, through today's talk. So I'm open for questions. I'll stop right there, and thank you so much for joining me today. You're on mute, Steve.
Thankfully, that's the only time this whole week that I've made that mistake, I promise. Could you just finish your screen share, Ernesto, because that's just going to stay on the screen. People won't be able to see you otherwise. So yeah, look, I mean, what I was saying, well, I was mouthing at Ernesto because nobody else could hear me. It's never simple entering a new market in any industry, in any kind of technology, but in healthcare more than any other, I think. And certainly from my point of view, at the end of that, I've got a pad full of questions. So what I would say to colleagues on the call is put your hand up, wave your hands around if you've got questions. If you haven't, I'm just going to end up quizzing Ernesto on my own. So I'm going to start while we're waiting for the guys on the call to start chipping in. I mean, first thing from me, in terms of regulation, in terms of how you regulate in the US, I do an awful lot of work with digital health companies. What are the sort of regulatory requirements? Do you require FDA regulatory approval for all kinds of digital health technologies, certain kinds of digital health technologies? What's the ecosystem for regulation like with digital?
And so that's an excellent question in terms of digital health, and it is an ever evolving field. And so I certainly encourage anyone with questions on regulation of any of the new types of technologies, whether it be AI or digital health or machine learning, to tune into the FDA's committee meetings. They have advisory committees on each of these types of technologies, and they're broadcast to the public when those committees meet. And the committees themselves is the conversation between the industry and the FDA to settle on how things are going to be regulated, what those benchmarks are going to be. And so, so definitely tune into that. Given with that said, I think that the digital health technologies that are informing healthcare decisions, so anything in the space of in analyzing and interpreting data, something that's really common nowadays is histology data analysis. So processing pathology and then having a computer scan a slide or a picture of a slide and finding pathology for a physician, and having that data inform what next steps the physician has to make. I think so those types of technologies are certainly classified typically as at a class 2 level at the FDA, because they're informing decision making at the physician level. Electronic medical records, I have to be honest, I do not know the regulation around them, but because of the compliance for data privacy, which we call HIPAA, there is certain metrics that need to be shown with respect to security, cybersecurity around those technologies. And so lots of moving parts there. Needless to say, the more involved the technology is in informing a physician and the decision-making process, the more heavily it will be regulated.
So what's the kind of, what would your advice be in terms of, who should, if I'm a digital health company looking to enter the US market, who should I be talking to first?
Sorry. Can you say that one more time?
So if I'm a digital health company with a product, with a UK-based product, for example, that wants to enter the US market, who should I be talking to first? What's my first stop?
And so the first stop there is going to be probably a regulatory consultancy. And that's because they're the ones that are going to tell you, okay, you need approval for this, and this is what that approval trajectory looks like. And if it's so that's one way. What's one person to talk to? If it's a product that they want to license out to a larger medtech strategic, then it's finding typically within, if they're establishing a hub, like I said before, through that network that's being developed from connecting with economic developers and public-private partnerships, finding that key person at a company that they wish to pitch to in terms of their exit strategies. So it kind of depends on where they want to go with that, but there's multiple ways. And then that large company can say, great, I like your technology, we'll take it through regulatory approval.
Thanks. Gabriella, you've got your hand up, you'd like to ask a question.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Ernesto, nice to meet you. I have a question. Could you clarify any language requirements? I'm familiar with the FDA and working in the US from a previous company. And I know, well, the US being so diverse and having so many different cultures that, they still speak their languages, the original languages, so many immigrants. Can you clarify a little bit any language requirements in the processes you mentioned that I'm sure will apply for pharmaceutical products, whether they're the same or not for medical devices, or probably as well for digital technologies now, growing. And if they are at the FDA level, or if companies would have to comply as well at the different state levels. Our previous experiences with a few labs and medical devices companies and even health insurance, and they were all of them had many different language requirements. I think it'll be interesting to learn more about that.
That is a fantastic question. Very true. A lot of especially in science, right? A lot of foreign-born citizens here. 60% of the workforce at the National Institutes of Health is actually foreign-born. And so it is that just speaks to, and that's a U.S. government lab. And so you can imagine how international and diverse, the actual private sector is if the government, the U.S. government, is that diverse. And so, but with respect to FDA regulations and the FDA itself, you have to be a U.S. citizen to work at the FDA. And I think even to access the FDA, foreigners have a really hard time just setting foot inside the FDA. Trust me, I tried getting a tour of the FDA for an international delegation, and I was very quickly shut down by them. And so with respect to the writing and the submitting of any regulatory document, that's really going to be strictly in English. For the most part, I feel like in terms of having a diversity in language is probably going to come a little bit later, post-regulatory approval, as you are trying to enter different pockets within the US market that speak different languages. And so that almost sounds like it would be at the marketing level, not at the approval level. Did that answer your question?
Partially. I remember, I think there are FDA regulations, or at least then later on Medicare, Medicaid, depending on the state regulations, that companies have to provide translated versions according to the demographics of the markets they're going to reach. And I remember specifically working on clinical trials that have to be in the original language used at the households where they were, the patients were inserted. This is apart from any interpreting at hospitals and hospital settings. But yeah, I remember one particular story. We would translate into Spanish the name of a medication, the generic name, not the brand name. And there was a special rule that we had to provide a pronunciation guide for this. And in Spanish, there's no need for a pronunciation guide. It's very transparent. It's very, very clear. Yeah. So we had to come up with something. Just because the FDA would not pass, would not approve the whole marketing, it was the insert, the product insert. It had to, and of course the packaging, it repeats in many other places. So we had to come up with something that the FDA would like for something that's not needed and doesn't exist in Spanish, for them to understand, all right, so your regulation says we need to provide a pronunciation guide for this generic name. This is what we came up with for Spanish, because there's no such a thing. So I'm sure there will be different, because they are based on the demographics, and it's regulatory, regulatory approval will be linked to the content that has to be distributed to patients and users, not just hospitals and doctors. And so I was wondering if you were more familiar, where would that fit in your process? Clearly, at some point past the first initial approval, but maybe there's some additional steps depending on the populations. Because as you know, it will vary with different states. You know, some states have, well, right now Spanish is no longer a minority language, you know, and so that was more or less, so my question.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. I would have to do a little bit of homework, to be quite honest. Past the approval stage, for the marketing purposes of it, now the actual commercialization piece, where does the language regulation come in? It's rare that I talk to a company at that stage when they're making inserts for their boxes for their products. A lot of our companies will exit before that. If that makes sense, they'll license their technology out, or they'll get bought out. And then like Merck will take care of that. You know what I mean? And so but if you drop me an email, I can find out for you, and I'll circle back and try to provide a little bit more clarity on that, because that is an excellent question. And
it's an interesting one, Ernesto. I just wonder, Ernesto, is there, thinking about it again from a UK regulatory point of view, once a drug goes onto the market, you have the kind of drug information leaflet that tells you what it is and how it works. And I think, if I remember rightly, there are some requirements around kind of the language, that being in different languages for different markets. Is all of the sort of regulatory stuff done entirely at a national level, or are there any kind of nuances around individual states?
No, it's done at the federal level. And for the regulatory approval, for sure. Some states may have certifications and licenses for laboratories, for example, and so it's more regulation in terms of the environment and biohazards, but it wouldn't be in addition to the FDA along that line at all. That's completely federal level.
Moving on to a slightly different topic, you talked a little bit there about the sort of sales process, if you like, for getting involved in individual hospital screen. It's kind of a two-part question, really, this. I mean, firstly, you talked about selling into the hospital and selling into the hospital ecosystem. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that ecosystem is structured, because clearly, from the UK, we're coming from a nationally regulated behemoth that is the NHS, that then splits down into individual hospitals with a certain amount of self-determination. Yours is an insurance-led model. So should I be talking to the insurer because they're the ultimate payer? Should I be talking to the individual hospital group? Is it the individual hospital, or is it the hospital group? How do I get involved in that ecosystem?
So step number one is to really have that reimbursement strategy in place. You're not going to get anywhere with a hospital if they don't know how your product was going to be paid for by the insurance company. Reimbursement consultants are not cheap, unfortunately. They're way more expensive than regulatory ones. I'll tell you that for the most part. But that's going to be step number one. So what are those CPT codes, and how is that, and how is that product going to be used and by whom, that then justifies the use of those CPT codes. It will be first. Then it's going to really be a conversation with that supply chain executive. Now, you can think of a hospital system as an incredibly fragmented space. And so, and for whatever reason, sometimes, departments will not necessarily talk to one another. It will be, they can really be sorted like there are individual universes. And so you can almost think of it like a family tree, where you have like the great grandparent big hospital, and then it kind of like branches, and just think of the family members as never talking to one another. And so that is not a uncommon occurrence. And so sometimes it's easier to find a physician champion that really wants to use your technology at conferences, at partnering events, and then work with them to approach the supply chain folks, to get that product, at least at the committee level, considered by the hospital. Hospitals have different requirements at different times. So while I was at the Department of Commerce, I would touch base with the Hopkins Hospital, with the Lifebridge Hospital, about once a year and say, hey, what do your needs look like? At one point, the Hopkins Hospital was looking for dialysis equipment, because they were no longer going to be contracting their dialysis services out to another company. They wanted to do that in-house. So that's when I looked at all of the companies in the renal space, and I emailed everybody and said, if you have, or if you're developing or have developed a dialysis technology, this is the time to go meet with the Johns Hopkins Hospital, because that's what they're looking for right now. And so there's a little bit of having that conversation and keeping tabs with the hospitals to get a better understanding as to when they'll need your technology. It's going to be really important. And then once they need it, then it's going to go into consideration. They'll want some samples. If all goes well, they'll move forward in adopting it that way. And then you move on to the next hospital system and approach them in a very similar way.
And I guess the kind of related question is that from my point of view, we're talking about hospital systems. And I think, it's one of the things we do across the global healthcare industry. We talk about hospitals and acute care all the time. How does it differ if I've got a product? How do I enter the market if I'm looking at a product that is aiming at either primary care, social care, or mental health? Is that a different ecosystem again?
Right. And so if it's going to be, so you mean yeah, so it depends on the user. And so if it's going to be something like mental health care, but it's really at the therapist level, then you're really going to want to talk to those individual private practices, because there's a lot more of those than there are central hospital-based practices for mental health care, unless it's something more on the psychiatric side of things. And so it's really asking the question, okay, who's using my technology? Where can I find these people, and then how do I go about approaching them? And sometimes it's going to be small clinics and small practices that are peppered across your region and across the US. Other times it's going to be, your best bet's going to be large research institutions. I don't know, Steve, did I answer your question?
And I guess what I'm thinking about here is, I mean, in the UK we have, primary care in terms of GP practices. You're quite small organisations. I guess what I'm really asking is, how does primary care work in the US? And if I'm selling into that sector of the health system, how do I go about it?
It's really, so if you think of primary care as a small, doctor's private practice, if you will, as opposed to, it works at exactly the same way. I mean, they're going to have to code that medical device in the exact same way that a large hospital would for reimbursement. For if it's a drug and you're your own drug company, then it's really about educating the physicians on your drug, and typically that's done kind of like by the big pharma that buy out companies. But if you are a smaller pharma but want to stay you want to go public and you want to stay your own individual entity, then it's about educating. Then if it's a drug for a pediatric drug for infections, then it's about educating the public and educating the physicians. And so then you need a team of people that goes out and spreads the knowledge that your drug is on the market.
So the message I'm getting, Ernesto, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike Northall's got a question which I'll come to in a second, but if I'm getting this right, the kind of summary that I take away from this is that entering the US market, there are really kind of three key things, key pieces of advice that I need to think about. One of them is, before I even start trying to sell this into a system, think about my regulatory requirements, ensure that I am ticking the right boxes with the FDA. The second one, again, before I even start thinking about selling into the US market, is that I need to start thinking about the insurers and the payment codes, and getting myself that payment code in order to then approach the hospital. And the third one, which I think is probably common for any health system in the world, is if I can buddy up with a doctor who likes my technology and will push it into his brethren, then I'm in a good place. Is that a good kind of summary of those kind of key steps?
I think that's a perfect summary. Thank you, Steve.
No problem. Mike, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We've got a digital product that's used in about 75% of all the NHS trusts in the UK. And we've got 4 clients, 4 hospitals in the States using the product. The question I was going to ask was, you mentioned that you're better off approaching each hospital independently. What about, say, for instance, HCA, who have a large number of hospitals? By the way, this product probably doesn't qualify for reimbursement. It's to do with improving patient outcomes and adhering to antimicrobial stewardship programs. Are you saying that I'd be wasting my time trying to go to the corporate office of HCA, pitch the product to them to see if they'd roll it out to all their hospitals, or I should go to each hospital individually?
And so it really depends on your capacity. I mean, I'm looking at that from what I said was really from the point of view of a smaller med tech company, a private company that has a couple of devices in their portfolio that they're not necessarily looking to get bought out by big med tech. And so there are large distributors for hospitals. And so if your company is at the level where you are able to play at that game just because you're able to supply at that level, then by all means, larger distributors are kind of the way to go. And so it really depends. I mean, you've had 4 hospitals. That's a wonderful selling point, and there's a lot of recommendations by word of mouth as well. Yeah. And so it's not, sometimes you don't even have to go to anybody. Sometimes then the clients will start coming to you based on the value that brings and how it's being used.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have been lucky because the 4 hospitals we've got in the States, and in fact, are all international, because we're only a small company. All our international sales have been through word of mouth. They've approached us. But exactly. one of the difficulties I've had is I have looked for partnerships or distribution channels to get into the US market. But most of the companies that I've found are looking to distribute what I'd call physical products as opposed to a service. And I'm struggling to find a partner that would distribute into the US healthcare market that specialize in a software and software as a service, as opposed to a physical product.
That is, yeah, I agree with you. I think I don't know of off the top of my head of any distributors that do distribute software as a service. Yeah, those large distributors, they'll distribute syringes because everyone needs like a bazillion of them. And so, I can definitely give them some thought. Again, why don't you drop me a line, and then we can take this conversation offline. And then we can ask some folks that are in the digital health space. The Association of Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare is actually based in Baltimore, and so I think that those would be the first people that I would introduce you to, because they're in the digital health space, and I think they would know if there's a place to point you in the right direction.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem.
I suppose the other question, I'm sort of pursuing this whole line about the different ecosystems and how you sell into the US healthcare system. What about if I've got a product or a service that I want to sell in at a systemic level? I mean, for example, we were talking about selling into the regulators themselves. So where you have the state healthcare system, where you have, is there any kind of centralization of data, any kind of centralization of patient records? How does that ecosystem work?
I'm sorry. So selling to the regulators themselves.
Well,
like the state government.
Yeah, so selling into the system itself. I mean, if you think about, I'll take the example of the session that we ran this morning on the Middle East. You're selling into three different levels. You're selling into the healthcare providers. You're selling into, or at least one of those levels is selling into government itself in terms of whether that's a public health program, whether that's a product that's aimed at sort of sharing data across multiple providers, et cetera, et cetera. How do you kind of get in at that level?
And so if I understand you correctly, like you want to sell perhaps to a state's like Department of Health.
Yeah.
That's like the system. And so for the most part, so there's a couple of ways of doing that. Number one, building relationships is incredibly important. So I was actually part of the Maryland Emergency Management Agency from March to June of last year, where we were procuring from the private sector PPE for the pandemic, right? So that's like selling into the system. And there was a couple of ways of doing that. But bottom line, selling to the government and to the system is about establishing those relationships with the procurement teams at those systems. And so for us, it was a matter of, number one, does your company have the track record of being in the healthcare medical supply chain business, because it was during an emergency, and of course everybody wanted to sell you PPE. But then it was really about, can you supply the volumes that we need for the demand, in this case for the pandemic, but in blue skies for the demand that's needed by the different departments of health. And so every state government will have, and city government will have requests for proposals at their procurement websites. And so it's about perusing what those requests are, selling to the government, whether it be federal, state, or city, county, even county and then city, is all about what is the market, what is their demand. And so they'll publish those proposals. But what I noticed was that the managers in charge of the proposals that were coming out had relationships with vendors, because they just had gotten to know those companies really well. And so it was almost like there was a short list of companies that the state and the city were willing to work with, because they just had established that relationship. And so it's about finding who in the government is in charge of the program, who's going to be that decision maker that's going to say, yeah, we'll buy some from you. And it's about getting to know them and getting them to understand where your company's at, where you want to go, what you're selling, how is it better than what's on the market, and then hopefully, you know, charming your way to having them give you a try and buying from you. Does that make sense? I mean, relationships are so
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the only kind of sort of slight offshoot, we've only got a minute left, but the only slight offshoot of that, I mean, in terms of understanding what kind of RFPs, what kind of opportunities and tenders there are out there, is it a question of you just got to do the legwork? You've just got to go to every individual state department of health, county, city, all the way around, or is there any kind of aggregator that would give me a kind of overview of what the kind of major opportunities floating out across the system look like?
That is an excellent question. There might, I don't know. I don't know if there's one central location. Given how each independent state government has its own system for everything, that's probably pretty different from a different state government. I don't see it easily being something that's created, but I'm sure some computer wizard out there could probably make something that scrapes the internet for opportunities, but not that I'm aware of, to be honest.
Well, if nothing else, Ernesto, maybe we've got an opportunity there to go into business together and create something.
That's right. That's right.
That's all we've got time for in this session. We've hit our 5 o'clock deadline. Thanks to Ernesto. Thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks for the people on the call and for your questions. Tomorrow, we've got another couple of brilliant sessions. We've got one on working with the aid funding organisations, the World Bank. That's at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. We've got a main stage session on Thursday on the future of healthcare in Africa. Hope you can join us for those. It's been a really long day, busy day, lots and lots of insight. More to come tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again very soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.